Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. What cyber liability errors and omissions coverages you really need with healthcare, legal, and CPA clients. I'm Sarah Duffy, the marketing manager here at Intronis, and I'm happy to be moderating today's session. Today, I am joined by Justin Rymuth, CEO of TechRug. During this live webinar, we will review the necessary coverages that a managed service provider or hosted solution provider should carry in dealing with personal, identifiable, or protected health information for their clients. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over some brief housekeeping. During the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to share them using the questions or chat panel to the right of the GoToWebinar screen. At the conclusion of the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a brief survey. Please take a moment to tell us what you think as we continuously improve the content and quality of our online events. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to today's presenter. Take it away, Justin.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sarah. First of all, I want to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy day to join this webinar. And, again, if you've got questions, I know Sarah is going to be monitoring that questions box, so feel free to just type them in and then she can interrupt me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. So today, I get a lot from even our current clients who will call us up and say, hey, Justin, I'm going to work with, this healthcare client, or I'm going to work with this law firm or this CPA client. If I do, this type of work, am I covered under my E&O policy? So, myself and my staff, we field a lot of these types of questions. So, we figured that we would just go over kind of what exactly is an E&O policy, and then if you are going to choose to work in these tightly regulated industries, what coverages that you want to make sure you have in place to protect your firm and organization from claims and circumstances that might lead to claims to better protect yourself. So just a little bit of background on myself and TechRug. I actually was involved in the IT industry. Our company, we did a lot of development back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And then, I'd gotten out of it just because of the different direction the company wanted to go, and moved back here. I was down in Dallas, Texas, moved back to Columbus, Ohio, and got involved in insurance back in 2004. And for the first couple of years, I was probably like a lot of people on this call, their local insurance agent, where, I would insure the bakery and the manufacturing company, the dry cleaner, people's homes and autos. And then in 2007, I was sitting down with a technology client, and we were going over some .NET development. He said, wow, you really understand IT. Is this something you specialize? So I thought, well, that's pretty, I guess with my background, that's not a bad idea. So, we really started niching. And back in 2001, when we got to a couple hundred clients, we actually started TechRug. And in 2015, TechRug kind of, again, became an insurance company, so to speak. So we've got our own policy form, much like a Hartford or a Travelers, where we wrote the policy form, we issue the policy form, we do all the endorsements, we do everything an insurance company would do. We just don't finance the claims. That's handled by our syndicate. So the name of our E&O product is called TechMow, and it's currently in place with about 900 IT companies in 47 states. So just a little bit of background about myself and TechReg. E&O policy forms, I'm amazed at the number of people when I'm talking to them and they say, yeah, I got E&O, as if all E&O policies are treated equal, and they're not. E&O policy forms are unregulated. So if I'm going to use the word regulated and unregulated, regulated type of insurance would be workers' comp and auto. It doesn't matter on your auto insurance if you've got, if you're with Hartford, Geico, Progressive, you pick the carrier. If you wreck your 3-year-old Honda, they're going to give you the value of the 3-year-old Honda. And same with workers' comp. If you get hurt, whether you're with, any particular carrier and one of the employees throws out their back, they're going to pay the back claim, right? So for quote unquote regulated policies, you always want to make sure that you're shopping price, right? But E&O policies are unregulated, and the policy language will vary from carrier to carrier. So some carriers might cover network security claims, some don't. Some might cover regulatory, some don't. There's two examples that I wanted to point out in the standard E&O policy that you want to make sure that you got coverage for. The first one is going to be client data loss. I mean, everybody is either, maintaining, processing, holding client data. So I put up two exclusions from two different carriers. And under Carrier A, the exclusion when they, this long drawn out sentence about reproducing, reprinting, restoring, withdrawal, recall, removal, basically what they're saying in this exclusion is that if you lose client data or you do something to corrupt that data, and it's as a result of your professional services, we are not going to replace, reproduce, recorrect, repair that data at all. So that is a definitive exclusion for client data loss. So a lot of people, again, a lot of our clients don't realize when they're coming over that, oh, wow, you mean I'm hosting clients' data and I don't have coverage for that? Whereas carrier B on this exclusion, they provide what we call a carve back, right? So they'll put in some similar language is carrier A, but then they carve it back and say that this exclusion shall not apply to third-party claims as a result of your technology-based services. So that's a carve back, and I can't tell you the amount of clients that, before they even came to us, or even I just hear nightmare stories where, they're coming out of pocket for large amounts of money, not only to pay like a drive saver or a third-party vendor, but then, that could also lead to, lost time that they could be spending because they don't have coverage on their managed service business, just dealing with the claims. So, you want to make sure anytime you go to an E&O policy, the very first section I always tell my clients to make sure that they're paying attention to is the exclusions. Is read through the exclusions, take a glance at them, and make sure that, that you have coverage for things like client data loss. Another one is bodily injury claims. So most E&O policies are going to exclude, bodily injury and property damage claims. Well, bodily injury, if you read the definition of what bodily injury covers, a lot of times it'll be infliction of emotional distress. Well, if you run into some sort of breach and you get thousands of patient records, there's going to be a class action lawsuit for probably infliction of emotional distress. Emotional distress is kind of like back pain on workers' comp, right? If I said I was sleeping 7 hours and now I'm only sleeping 6 hours and it affects my quality of life, how do you disprove that, right? So, if you have a clear-cut exclusion for these bodily injury claims, again, and I think, HIPAA wall of shame, I think if it's over 500 names or something, it becomes public. But, if anyone's ever been in a car accident on this, unfortunately, the day after that, if you've been a little fender bender, you'll get a bunch of calls from chiropractors and attorneys, and they'll want to collect on your behalf. Well, now you've got these attorneys that are doing the same for these privacy violations, where they'll, put a class action lawsuit against, the IT provider and, file a Freedom of Information Act, get under the Freedom of Information Act, get client information from them, and then you could be facing a pretty stiff lawsuit. So those are kind of two exclusions, again, I just picked out two, that under standard E&O policy that you want to pay attention to is make sure you got coverage for contingent bodily injury and property damage claims, as well as client data loss. Now, when you're dealing with the regulated industries that we talked about, healthcare, legal, CPA, could be GLB, Sarbanes-Oxley, you got to make sure that not only do you have the technology E&O, but you want to make sure that you've got what we call first and third party cyber liability. So over these next couple of slides, I'm going to go over what the first and third party cyber liability coverages actually mean. So insuring agreement 1 is computer network security. So if you are in charge of maintaining people's networks, you have to make sure that you've got computer network security coverage. This is going to protect you against claims that would be unauthorized access into your computer system or your client's computer system. It could be transmission of a virus or malicious code. Obviously the number one claim that we see usually has to do with client data loss, or 2 of the top 3 claims that we see is client data loss and network security failures, right? And oftentimes, even these lawsuits, if they're not about negligence, they're about the allegations of negligence. So we see clients that spend, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, or our carriers, our syndicate does, defending clients, maybe being in a situation that they shouldn't have been in the first place. So, computer network security is a must. The next one I wanted to point out was these exclusions, kind of going back to the exclusions in the network security. The first, carrier A and B. Carrier A, and this is a tough one to live with. Basically, what they're saying is, if you read number 2, is that a lot of times when you're filling out these applications, you'll get the carrier that'll ask you, do you use, or do you, every time there's an update, are you installing all software updates and patches and things of that nature. Well, anybody that's in the industry knows that, there's things like whitelisting, or you might want to wait a couple days. So if you're not going to the next version, I'm going to point out, in this next slide, a claim that had come up. But if you don't have, if you have that exclusion in your E&O policy and you aren't keeping up with, and you are whitelisting stuff, you could be in trouble. Carrier B, again, is much more lenient when on their exclusion, and they're not saying that, hey, listen, you got to go to the next update. They're saying within a reasonable period of time, right? So either one of those exclusions, and Carrier B is probably rare. More policies out there tend to have Carrier A exclusion over Carrier B, but you're going to have to live with one exclusion. So would you want to live with, hey, you got to do the next update right away, or do you want to live with as soon as reasonably possible? Most of our clients want to live with as soon as reasonably possible. And I'm going to point out an example of a claim. I think if you Google healthcare IQ news cottage health, you'll see that there was a claim, and this goes back to this previous slide where Cottage Health had answered yes, that they were not only performing due diligence on their third-party vendors. So imagine that they've got to go into Microsoft, Sarah and Tronis, and do these third-party due diligence security checks audits once a year, which Microsoft and Intronis aren't going to let you into their network, so that would be impossible to do. But the other thing is they checked that Cottage Health that they would regularly maintain security patches on its system. So because of that, the carrier had paid out millions and millions of dollars in notification costs. But then when they found out that, hey, listen, you weren't running the next version, and you told us you would audit these third-party vendors and you didn't, they wanted their money back, right? So that's an example where again, you got to live with, hey, do this and within a reasonable period of time, or you've got to live with you got to have the next version up to date the next day. So you want to make sure that E&O policy, that the cyber coverages there are a little more lenient in favor of you. The second coverage is this electronic media liability. More and more business insurance policies under their personal and advertising injury are excluding claims for libel, slander, defamation as it relates to any social networking sites, right? So what they're doing is, years ago when you take out this $500 business policy, they didn't imagine the insurance carriers that, LinkedIn and Facebook and these social networking sites could get them into these libel, slander, defamation claims, but they did. So the carriers over the last several years have been carving back and excluding coverage for libel, slander, defamation as it relates to your media activities. So they're pushing that over to the cyber liability carrier. We had one instance where an MSP had taken a client, it was like $20,000 a month managed service client. And, he was telling the CFO of this company, hey, listen, not only is the company doing A, B, and C, we can do it a little bit better, but you're also going to save 5% or whatever the number was. So the CFO, when they went to kind of fire that old company, because it was a bigger account, turned around and sued our MSP for libel, slander, and defamation. Obviously, the business insurance carrier had denied the claim, so they kicked it over to the E&O carrier. Now, once the other MSP found out that they had the backing of an insurance company, they quickly dropped the claim because they knew they didn't have, the documentation to support the claim. But still, that's an instance where, these business insurance policies are kicking more and more over to the E&O carrier. So you want to make sure that you've got what we call media liability or electronic media liability coverage on your cyber E&O policy. The third one is privacy liability. And when you're dealing with the theft, loss, disclosure of personally identifiable or protected health information, that's not always going to be, due to a hack, malware, and virus. Quite honestly, we've had instances where, people have been taking back laptops or servers back to the office. They'll pull into Starbucks, get something to drink. Somebody bashes in and steals that server, right? Or steals that laptop. And if it's unencrypted, you got to report it. So, when it comes to the privacy insurance, the hacks, malware, and viruses, that makes the news. That's about 45% of the claims that get turned in. But 55% of the claims that get turned in are things like a staff mistake, rogue employee, theft of hardware, lost or stolen laptops. So, you got to be careful and make sure that you've got this privacy liability, not only from the hacks, malware, and viruses, but for the other instances that I mentioned. And then, to point 4, if you do have the theft or disclosure of this personally identifiable or protected health information, you got to notify people. There's certain laws and timelines, so many days that you have to notify people if their information is compromised, right? So I pulled up a Net Diligence does this cyber liability and data breach insurance claim study. And I don't know if the 2016 version's out yet, but I pulled the 2015 version, and it was about $107 per record. So imagine if you had to notify 1,000 people. Right off the bat, you're looking at $100,000 plus claims. So, just the notification costs, right? I mean, they can potentially, bankrupt a company if you don't have this insuring agreement on your cyber liability policy. The fifth point I wanted to bring up was public relations and crisis management, right? So you got to have a bucket there for if a breach does occur and you make, the company news or the newspaper, you better believe that your competition is going to, inundate, as much as they can, try to use that as a competitive advantage against you. And I think they say for $1 of bad PR, you need $10 of good PR, right? So, you've got to have money in a bucket to hire an ad agency. It reminds me of that BP oil spill. It's in my head right now because I remember here sitting in Columbus, Ohio, it seemed like every commercial when I was watching TV with my son would be, a BP sponsored commercial that would say, come down to the Gulf. It's the greatest tourism ever, right? Well, why is BP doing that? A, to get their good name back, but they also want to get people down, the Gulf and spending their tourism dollars so that they don't have to, sit there and pay lost wages and stuff like that, right? So, you want to make sure that, you've got enough money to have a public relations crisis management firm there to protect you. Regulatory defense, right? So if you're going to fall under, if you're signing, business associates agreement, and you're being treated the same as a covered entity, right? Or you're dealing with PCI. If you do something that leads to some sort of regulatory fine or penalty as it relates to your professional services, a typical standard E&O policy is not going to cover. It has exclusions for regulatory defense and penalties. So a cyber policy, you want to make sure that you've got coverage for these regulatory defense and penalties. I mean, I've seen these specialized attorneys, regulatory defense attorneys, and the amount of money that they charge it's crazy. I mean, I guess I need to get out of insurance and go back to being a regulatory defense attorney because, I mean, the price tag is it's exorbitant, right? And then I know people say, these fines, penalties that you can get, they go up to, I think, I could be wrong if I say this, but the last one I read was like up to $1.5 million. Now, again, you'd have to be pretty negligent to get to that, to that number. But still, even if you had a fine or a penalty of $50,000 or $100,000, it's still going to be a lot to self-insure if you don't have the regulatory defense and penalties coverage on it. These next two are what we call first-party costs, right? So a lot of people on their business insurance will carry business income in case of a fire or wind, right? So if it knocks down your business and you can't operate your business, you want the insurance company, to pay you lost time, lost wages after a 24-hour period. Well, the same holds true for your IT systems, right? You want to make sure that you have a cyber policy that includes first-party data protection and network business interruption. Because what happens if due to a hack, your systems go down and your data is corrupted, right? And you're down for a week. You want to make sure that not only from the data corruption standpoint that you can have money in a fund set aside to recreate that data and any costs associated with it, but if you can't operate your business, because everything anymore it seems like is relying on the web. I mean, you got to have access to email, you got to have access to your management system, you got to have access to your client system. If any of that sort of stuff is impacted, you want to make sure that after 10, 12, 24 hours that you've got some sort of income loss coverage in there to compensate yourself or your business for any lost wages. The last one I wanted to point out is what we call cyber extortion, right? So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people on this call or companies on this call have had clients that have been hit with, ransomware, right? A crypto virus, whatever it may be. They say it's the next big thing. I think it's already here, right? But, cyber extortion is essentially kidnap and ransom, where somebody says, hey, listen, I've got your data. If you want that data back, give me, $50,000, right? So the insurance companies, via a cyber endorsement called cyber extortion, will actually set aside funds to pay to get that data back because, they feel like, hey, it's better to pay $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 than if you're going to be down for a month and you're doing, $10,000 a day, all of a sudden now they're in a pretty big business interruption claim. So, the cyber extortion will help pay to get that data back. One thing I wanted to point out was, cyber crime, and it's just now starting to become available, But some carriers now are starting to add on the cyber E&O policy. They'll add an endorsement for certain parts, certain cyber crime coverages. Two of the most important are probably funds transfer and cyber deception. Recently, we just had an IT company on the East Coast that the owner had gone on vacation and was somewhere, down in, I think it was the Caribbean, and his office manager had gotten an email that looked like it was from him, but one character or one letter was off. And, just not thinking anything of it because they're always paying vendors, she thought, okay, I'll just send a $40,000 check. So, it didn't have his signature, nothing. And she sent it and they were out $40,000. So, that's what I mean by cyber deception is if somebody acts like a vendor, employee, client and tricks you into transferring money to them, you got to make sure that you've got some sort of cyber deception, or we call it fraudulent instruction coverage. But the funds transfer, I was on a call with a carrier and they were talking about how sophisticated these criminals are, where if you open up some sort of malware or some sort of attachment, a lot of times there'll be programs in that attachment that seek to find banking, routing, account information. So, if there is some sort of unauthorized electronic funds transfer out of your account because, something was, compromised, your systems were compromised, you want to make sure that you've got money for that. I've had my clients check with their banks and say, hey, listen, if this were to happen to me, would I be, compensated for the money that was out of the account? And the two answers I've always heard is we've got enough practices and procedures in place to make sure that doesn't happen, which is no. Or the other answer is you need a cyber crime policy in place. So, crime is becoming more and more, of a serious problem. I mean, we see it not only with our managed service clients, but their clients. And a lot of times our managed service clients are being sued because, their clients have been, caught in a cyber deception or funds transfer. So two areas you want to pay when I say first party, but third party coverages, right? I mean, your techs have unprecedented access to client systems. And, what happens if a tech steals from your client? We've seen it happen. And you want to make sure that, that you've got coverage to compensate that client. And the only way to do it is either self-insure it or make sure that you've got, on your crime coverage that you've got third-party crime. Now, again, a business insurance policy will cover employee dishonesty if an employee steals from you, but they're not going to cover if they steal from a client. So that third-party crime coverage is extremely important. And Sarah, with that being said, I, kind of wanted to wrap things up and go to any questions that, that any of the companies might have as it relates to, our presentation.
Great. Thanks, Justin. If you have any questions, you can submit them in the questions panel to the right of your GoToWebinar screen. There have been a few questions here, Justin, about the presentation, receiving a copy of the presentation, the recording. The presentation is being recorded and will be sent out within 24 hours post the webinar. And I do see a few questions coming in here, Justin.
Okay.
All right, so first question we have here is, do individual technicians have reason to seek their own E&O insurance?
If they're part of the company, no, because the definition of an employee under an E&O policy would be, they're covered under the definition of what we call an insured, right, employee. One thing that the individual asking, if you're using subcontractors, you might want to make sure that, that your E&O policy covers subcontractors, because if they don't and they're working on your behalf and they lose client data or cause a network security failure, if they're not listed as the definition of insured, you're going to be self-insuring that claim. But, kind of going into a risk management with my risk management hat on, into that mode is that, if you're going to use independent contractors or subs, make sure that they have E&O insurance, because you don't want your policy to be first in line. So, if they do something that causes, client data loss or network security failure, you want their policy to be first and yours to be second. But if it's just an employee, they're covered under the definition of an insured.
Next question we have here is, how much of a difference does it make to high trust certified in terms of insurance cost?
One more time, I'm sorry. High trust, did you say?
Yes.
I don't know. Are they asking just how much is an insurance policy?
Nicole, if you're still on, can you re-ask your question, please?
I mean, and to that point, just talking about them, if you get with an agent or an agency that specializes, these cyber E&O policies, they don't have to be as expensive as you think. I mean, I can tell you $1 million client should be paying, I don't know, $1,300 a year with $1,000 deductible for first and third party cyber E&O with client data loss, network security, all that sort of stuff. So, if you go to somebody that maybe doesn't specialize and they don't really have access to, some of the top markets or the most competitive markets, and they're just going into their network of insurance carriers, sometimes we've seen clients, like I was on the phone with a client today that was just, they were about a $4 million client, and they were paying close to $7,000 in E&O for just standard E&O insurance. I mean, that's super expensive. Something like that should probably cost $2,400.
Our next question here is, do you offer these policies across the country to MSPs?
Yeah, so we, as far in terms of TechRug, we're licensed in all 50 states, and I think, as I mentioned in my earlier, we're in 48 of those states. So we're able to offer, and the policy with TechRug, for instance, I mean, it doesn't change state to state, right? I mean, the policy, whether you're in Ohio, Massachusetts, Florida, Texas, everyone gets the same policy. And again, the way we treat our clients is if you fall within certain revenue ranges, we treat everybody the same. So, every $1 million TechRug client is going to pay, the same premium, whether, doesn't matter what state they're in.
Okay, great. A follow-on to that question here is, interested in Justin's services, does he have contact information he can share?
Sarah, I think, and you probably are a better resource for this than I am. I mean, I think you've got on my signature has my email and direct line and all that.
Okay. Yep. We can share that with you, Pete, as well, with anyone else that's interested in Justin's information. Another question here. I know you touched on this briefly, Justin. As an MSP, should we assume our clients have the same type of coverage? So their insurance coverage would reimburse them for the cost of our labor in case of network security failure, malware, breach, etc.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I always tell my MSPs that, because we'll get a lot of questions like, do our clients need cyber liability insurance? Yes, they do. Because anyone, I'll go back to what I had mentioned earlier in the call, that net diligence cyber claim study that I referenced, if you read it, 45% of the claims that get turned in are due to hacks, malware, and viruses. But 55% of the claims that get turned in are things that our MSPs are not responsible for. They're not responsible for a staff mistake at the doctor's office. They're not responsible for a rogue employee at the law firm. They're not responsible for the lost or stolen laptop that happened at the accounting office, right? So every MSP's client that handles, maintains, processes PII or PHI, they need their own cyber policy. The other thing is, and I don't know if our MSPs here, a lot of them are using contracts, but if they've read a contract with, for example, their cloud provider, the ones that I've seen often limit the liability, right? So let's say they limit it to 2 months of fees, right? 2 months of, so, if you're paying, I'm just going to use round numbers, if you're paying that cloud provider $10,000 a month, they're limiting $20,000. Well, what happens if they have a breach on their end, right? not only do our MSPs want to make sure that their E&O will stand in between that gap. So if there's a $100,000 claim and the cloud provider only is going to cover 20, they want to make sure that they have coverage for that 80,000. But the same thing is if our MSPs are limiting their liability with their clients, right? It's even more important that their clients have a cyber liability policy that will come in and help protect them, against, any sort of cyber claim that might come down.
Okay, great. Next question we have here is, will this be covered under the normal business insurance?
Great question. No. So business insurance policies have professional services exclusions, which leads a doctor to carry medical malpractice, an architect to carry architect's professional liability, an insurance agent to carry insurance agent E&O, and again, an IT company to carry technology errors and omissions insurance. So, a business insurance policy, those are, they're $500. They're meant to cover general liability claims, which again, when you add the professional services exclusions, is basically slip falls in your office, or I don't know, you knock over a vase at the client site. You've got some auto liability where if a tech's driving in their car and they get into an accident and the company gets brought into a lawsuit, you want to make sure that you've got hired, non-hired automobile liability. But that business insurance is really there to protect against, general liability, auto liability, property, client equipment in your care, custody, and control, transit. It's going to have a professional services exclusion, which kicks this coverage for client data loss, network security failures, breach of contract, all over to the E&O provider.
Great. Next question we have here is, do you offer a referral program for us to offer cyber liability insurance?
So we don't have a referral program. You have to be a licensed agent to, share what we call commissions. So we don't really have a referral. I guess we've sent people, gift cards and stuff like that. But TechRug, and, maybe this is important for another call, but we're actually working on something where you can extend data breach coverage to your client via an endorsement. I don't want to get ahead of myself too far, but we've created an endorsement where if our MSPs, if their clients have certain IT services in place with those MSPs, like firewall, antivirus, backup, encryption of mobile devices, laptops that contain PHI and PII, their clients can have access to a data breach endorsement at an extremely discounted price. But we're kind of finalizing some things. We're still, 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks away from something like that.
Great. Looking forward to doing that presentation, Justin.
Yeah, it's something that no one else is doing, right? So it's probably if we wanted to do it once we got it up, I can contact you. But it's definitely to make yourself stickier with your IT client. Sorry, I'm getting feedback there. To make yourself stickier with your client, right? If they have to meet certain requirements, whether it's encryption of laptops and mobile devices, that's better. Whether it's firewall, antivirus, we've had in kind of our test quote unquote study, we've even had MSPs where if they wanted a client to be more secure to get off Windows XP because it's not being supported anymore, we just tell them to add that to the letter. Anything that would make that client more secure, our syndicate's totally fine with. But as a result of that, the great thing about this endorsement is that because it's being added onto the MSP E&O policy, if that client were to ever leave them, the endorsement goes away. So it kind of creates that stickiness factor, but it also gives their client, some coverage that they desperately need.
Very interesting. All right. It looks like we have some additional questions here, Justin. We also have errors and omissions insurance. Will that cover it, or should we specify?
Yeah, so again, it's the earlier part of the presentation. E&O policies are not created equal, right? They're unregulated. So you got to look at, what insuring agreements on the policy. Do you have an insuring agreement for privacy liability? Do you have an insuring agreement for regulatory defense and penalties? Check out the exclusions. Do you have coverage for client data loss? As far as network security failures, do you have to upgrade your clients to the next version of the antivirus and the firewall, or can you do it within a reasonable period of time? So without actually looking at their E&O policy, I couldn't really comment on what coverages they do or don't have, but I would definitely look at the insuring agreements, which are going to tell you what coverage is in place, and then look at the exclusions and see what you have to live with. And don't get me wrong, Sarah, all E&O policies are going to have exclusions, right? But, you want to make sure that you can live with those certain exclusions. I know that a TechRug client, we give all of our clients access to an MSA, a Master Services Agreement, and Statement of Work that mirrors our E&O policy form. So if there's an exclusion that really matters in the E&O policy, it's referenced in the contract. And I'll just give one quick example. Most contracts have a force majeure clause, but when I look at these contracts, they don't have electrical and mechanical disturbances. So all TechRug clients, when they get a copy of our MSA, it not only says that our MSPs are not responsible for acts of God, a force majeure clause, but it also says they're not responsible for electrical and mechanical disturbances. And the reason that's important is, let's say that you have a power failure or some sort of like the power goes out, electric surge. And when the power company comes out and re-engages that power, the power supply, let's say for some reason the antivirus and the firewall don't load, right? And then the next morning, the office manager for your client comes in, they click on malware and they get the crypto virus and they're shut down for 3 days and they want $50,000, right? No E&O policy is going to cover electrical and mechanical disturbances. So if you don't reference that in your contract that you're not responsible for electrical and mechanical disturbances, and the E&O carrier isn't going to provide that coverage, all of a sudden now, you're left paying that $50,000 claim out of your own pocket.
Looks like we have one last question here, Justin. The question we have here is, will Justin review policies for us? And if so, how much would you charge for this?
I mean, yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, we have to, sorry, I'm getting feedback, Kim. I have to see copies of E&O policies just to make sure. I mean, again, our policies, a full first and third party policy, but, we always check people's current coverages, not only to point out differences, but just to make sure that there isn't something in there that perhaps, carriers are constantly endorsing policies. We just are rewriting some policy language and updating policy language on our form as well. But we always want to take a look at a policy just to make sure that there's something in there that they might have coverage for that we wouldn't be offering. We wouldn't want to switch somebody and cut their coverage. Not that hasn't happened, knock on wood, so far. Cut their coverage, and then all of a sudden, I would be held liable. So for my E&O, we take a look at people's policies, just to protect ourselves and make sure that, when they're switching over, not only are they losing things, but we might point out things that they're gaining. But we don't, just to let you know, it's not like a separate line item where somebody says, hey, can I pay you $50 or $100 to review a policy? We don't really do that. We do it more or less when people are switching over.
Great. Well, thank you, Justin. Great presentation today on cyber liability. So I want to thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the next one. And everyone have a great day.
Thanks, Sarah.